Richard Speck. In a single night, 8 young women who shared a quiet townhouse were gone. The only reason the world ever learned what happened is that one of them found a place to hide. The victims were student nurses in their early 20s, training at a hospital on the south side of Chicago. They shared a townhouse dormitory in a calm residential neighborhood, the kind of place where the doors were not always locked and danger felt like something that happened elsewhere. On the night of July 13th, 1966, that illusion shattered. The man who broke in was Richard Speck, a drifter and petty criminal who had been arrested more than 40 times by his mid-20s. He had come to the area looking for work as a seaman at a nearby union hall. Instead, armed and methodical, he forced his way into the townhouse, bound the women with strips of bedsheet, and over the course of several hours, led them away, one by one. By morning, 8 of them were dead. It was a crime so cold and deliberate that the city of Chicago struggled to comprehend it. How did even one person survive a night like that? Her name was Corazon Amurao, and her instinct saved her life. As the horror unfolded, she rolled beneath a bed and stayed perfectly still, hidden in the dark while she waited for it to end. The man moving through the apartment apparently lost count of how many women were inside, and that single miscalculation meant Amurao was overlooked. When dawn came and the apartment fell silent, she climbed onto a ledge and screamed for help, becoming the sole witness to one of the most shocking crimes in American history. What she gave investigators changed everything. Amurao provided a detailed description of the intruder, including a forearm tattoo that read, "Born to raise hell." Fingerprints lifted from the scene matched Speck, and after a suicide attempt, landed him in a hospital. An emergency room doctor recognized that very tattoo and alerted police. Speck was arrested on July 17th, 1966, only days after the killings. The case against him was overwhelming. A jury convicted Speck in April of 1967 after deliberating for less than an hour, and he was sentenced to death. But after a United States Supreme Court ruling on capital punishment a few years later, his sentence was converted to a string of lengthy prison terms, described in some accounts as more than 400 years. He would be denied parole again and again, and he never walked free. Now, here is where the legend and the truth split apart. Because 2 myths have trailed this case for decades. The first is the date of his death. Many retellings claim he died in 1994. In reality, Speck died of a heart attack on December 5th, 1991, one day before his 50th birthday. After collapsing in prison, his body went unclaimed and was quietly cremated. The second myth is even more persistent. For years, people repeated the claim that Speck possessed an extra Y chromosome, a so-called genetic marker for violence. It is simply false. Testing showed he had a normal chromosome makeup, and the theory linking that condition to aggression was itself discredited long ago. There was no biological excuse hiding in his cells. There was only a man who made a series of monstrous choices. What truly chills people about this case is not a chromosome or a tattoo. It is the ordinariness of the setting. A group of young women asleep in a home they trusted, on a summer night like any other. Decades later, a secretly recorded prison video surfaced showing Speck living comfortably behind bars, unrepentant and even boasting about the murders. A final reminder that the man responsible felt nothing resembling remorse. The footage outraged the public when it was made known, precisely because it confirmed there was no hidden depth of regret to find. For the families of the 8 nurses, no sentence and no death could ever balance what was taken in those few dark hours. 8 futures, 8 careers in caring for others, ended in a single night by a stranger who had simply walked through an unlocked door. It remains one of the defining nightmares of its era, the case that taught a generation that safety could be an illusion. The next case unfolded not in a single night, but over a slow and unimaginable stretch of time on the other side of the world. The Hello Kitty murder. A cheerful cartoon doll became the symbol of one of the most disturbing cases in Hong Kong's history. What investigators found inside it is the reason this story has never been forgotten. The victim was Fan Man Yi, a young woman who had endured a hard life from the very start. She had grown up in an orphanage and, pushed out on her own as a teenager, had drifted into difficult and dangerous work. By her early 20s, she was a nightclub hostess and a mother, doing whatever she could to stay afloat. She was, in many ways, exactly the kind of person the world tends not to protect. Then, she made a single mistake that would cost her everything. Fan had taken a sum of money, the equivalent of roughly $500 from a member of a local criminal triad named Chan Man Lok. When he found out, he demanded far more than she had taken, adding a steep fee on top of the original amount. It was a debt she had no way to repay. And rather than let it go, Chan and two associates decided to make a brutal example of her. What began over a relatively small sum spiraled into something monstrous. What happened next is almost too dark to absorb. In the spring of 1999, the group held Fan captive in an apartment on Granville Road in the busy Tsim Sha Tsui district, a neighborhood full of shops and tourists who had no idea what was happening behind one closed door. She was imprisoned there for roughly a month and severely mistreated by her captors, hidden away while life carried on as normal just outside the walls. She did not survive. Afterward, in an effort to hide what they had done, the killers concealed her remains, hiding part of them inside a large Hello Kitty mermaid doll, a detail so grotesque it gave the entire case its name. How does a crime this hidden ever come to light? The answer came from a frightened young witness connected to the group, someone who had seen far too much. Haunted by what had happened, she eventually went to the police and led them to the apartment. There, officers recovered the grim evidence that confirmed her account, and the case that had been buried behind a closed door finally broke open. She would later testify in exchange for immunity. The legal outcome surprised many. In December of 2000, after a 6-week trial, 3 men were convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter. The reason was strangely technical. Because the remains were so degraded, the court could not rule out other possible causes of death, and that uncertainty meant the more serious charge could not stand. Still, the judge condemned the staggering cruelty of the crime, calling it without precedent in the city. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment. So where are the killers now? Chan Man Lok and a co-defendant named Lung Wai Lun continued serving their life sentences in a Hong Kong prison. A third man, Lung Xing Shou, won a retrial, pleaded guilty to manslaughter, had his sentence reduced to 18 years, and was released around 2014. The differing outcomes reflected the tangled web of guilt the courts had to untangle among the group. There was a quiet, almost gentle epilogue to all of it. Fan Man Yi's skull was eventually returned to her family and cremated, giving her at least some measure of peace in death that she had been so cruelly denied in life. The building where she was held was later torn down and replaced by a hotel, and the site that rose in its place quietly incorporated a small memorial with portraits meant to honor the dead. A reminder of the woman whose suffering the world only learned about because one witness could not stay silent. What makes this case linger is the contrast at its heart. A symbol of childhood innocence, a smiling pink doll, became the hiding place for something unspeakable. It is the kind of detail the mind simply refuses to let go of. The reason this story still surfaces in conversations decades later, half a world away from where it happened. For many, it is impossible to look at that cheerful cartoon face again without remembering Fan Man Yi. The next case moved from a single victim to a number almost too large to comprehend, hidden beneath the soil of a California orchard. Juan Corona. A farmer noticed a hole in his orchard that had been freshly dug and then filled back in. What lay beneath it would lead to the discovery of one of the largest series of killings the country had ever seen. The victims were transient farm workers, mostly middle-aged men who traveled from job to job along California's Feather River. Men whose absence often went unnoticed because they had few permanent ties. That very invisibility is what allowed the crimes to go undetected for so long. Who raises the alarm for a drifter who simply moves on? The man at the center of the case was Juan Corona, a licensed farm labor contractor in Sutter County who hired and oversaw crews of these workers. He had a documented history of mental illness. To the people who relied on him for work, he was a familiar and even trusted figure. None of them could have guessed what was unfolding in the orchards. The case broke on May 19, 1971, when a farmer named Goro Kagehiro spotted that disturbed patch of earth on his land. Curious and uneasy, he reported it. And when authorities investigated, they uncovered a body. It was only the beginning. As searchers combed the orchards, they unearthed grave after grave, until the total reached an almost unimaginable 25 victims, all killed and buried over the span of just a few months. Try to picture that scene for a moment. Investigators arriving at peaceful peach orchards, then digging and finding another body and another. Each new grave deepened the dread and raised the same impossible question. How had so many men been killed and buried so close together without a single alarm being raised? The answer lay in who the victims were. They were men on the margins, easy to erase, and that is precisely what made them targets. How do you tie one man to so many deaths? The evidence mounted quickly. Investigators recovered weapons, including a long machete and blood-stained knives, along with bloody clothing and receipts signed by Corona near the burial sites. Most damning of all was a ledger containing a list of names, a document the press would come to call the death list. Corona was arrested on May 26, 1971, just 1 week after the first grave was found, and the small farming county suddenly found itself at the center of a national sensation. His path through the courts was long and complicated. Corona was convicted on 25 counts of murder in early 1973. An appeals court later overturned that conviction over concerns about the quality of his legal representation. And he was retried years later in a different city. This time, his defense tried to shift the blame onto his late brother, suggesting another hand had committed the crimes. The second jury was no more convinced than the first. Corona was again convicted on all 25 counts and given 25 life sentences to be served at the same time. Would he ever see the outside again? He would not. Corona was denied parole 8 separate times over the decades that followed. While behind bars, he was attacked by another inmate and lost sight in one eye. He died of natural causes on March 4, 2019, at the age of 85. While being held in protective custody, his crime still ranking among the worst in the state's history. What makes this case so haunting is the sheer scale of it, and how nearly it was missed entirely. These were men society had largely overlooked while they were alive, and they were buried in a way meant to ensure they stayed overlooked in death. If not for one observant farmer pausing over a patch of freshly turned soil, the orchards might have kept their secret far longer, and the true number of victims might never have been known at all. For years afterward, Corona's name was spoken in the same breath as the worst killers in the country, and his case forced a hard reckoning with how easily vulnerable people can vanish without anyone noticing. The men buried in those orchards had families somewhere, lives that simply stopped. That is the quiet terror at the center of this story, that a person can disappear so completely their death goes unremarked until a stranger happens to dig in the wrong spot. The next case has no conviction and no ending, only a wealthy family, a sleeping daughter, and a killer who slipped back into the dark before anyone could stop him. Valerie Percy. An intruder crept into a lakefront mansion before dawn and attacked a young woman in her own bed. Her mother saw him standing there. To this day, no one knows who he was. Valerie Percy was 21, the daughter of Charles Percy, who at the time was running for the United States Senate and would go on to serve 3 terms. She was not only his daughter, but also worked as an aide on his campaign, a bright young woman at the center of a rising political family. They lived in an affluent lakefront home in Kenilworth, a wealthy Chicago suburb so peaceful it had never recorded a single murder. That spotless record ended in the early hours of September 18, 1966. Sometime around 5 in the morning, an intruder entered the house through broken glass and made his way to Valerie's bedroom, where he attacked and killed her. The noise woke her mother, Jeanne, who hurried toward the room and came face to face with the assailant standing over the bed. In a moment that must have frozen her in terror, he shined a flashlight directly into her eyes, then turned and fled toward the lakeshore, vanishing into the dark. Was this a robbery gone wrong? The evidence said otherwise. Valerie's wallet, containing about $60, was left untouched, which told investigators that whoever did this had not come for money. The motive, whatever it was, remained a mystery. And that mystery only deepened as the investigation widened into one of the largest in the region's history. Just how massive was the search? Authorities questioned roughly 14,000 people and chased more than 1,300 separate leads. A few names surfaced over the years, including a pair of professional burglars who were considered early suspects, but never charged in the killing. But the most striking lead came decades later. FBI records obtained by a Chicago news team pointed to a violent young heir named William Thorson, whose family lived barely a block and a half from the Percys, and who was known to keep an enormous cache of weapons. Investigators came to believe the weapon may have been a serrated blade consistent with items he owned. So why was he never charged? Thorson was never able to answer for the crime one way or another. He was shot and killed by his own wife in 1970, years before the FBI material drawing attention to him ever became public. Investigators have said he was never cleared, and that his possible involvement remains undetermined. With the prime suspect dead and beyond questioning, the trail grew colder still, leaving only theories where a confession might have been. What keeps this case alive in the public imagination is everything that remains hidden. Kenilworth police still describe the investigation as active and ongoing, and they fought successfully in court to keep roughly 20,000 pages of case files sealed, defeating a public records lawsuit brought by an attorney who wanted them opened. A reward once offered by Senator Percy was eventually withdrawn. An author later wrote a book arguing that Thorson was the killer, but without a confession, a conviction, or living testimony, it remains one theory among several. More than half a century on, the Percy case endures as one of the most unsettling, unsolved crimes in American history. A prominent family, a daughter killed in the supposed safety of her own bedroom, a mother who looked into the eyes of the man responsible, and yet no name, no arrest, and no closure. The killer walked out toward the lake that morning and, in every meaningful sense, was never seen again. Charles Percy went on to win his Senate seat just weeks after burying his daughter, and he served for years in Washington, all while the question of who killed Valerie hung over the family like a shadow that never lifted. The sealed files only deepened the public's unease, because somewhere in those thousands of pages may sit the answer, locked away from the very people who have spent decades wanting it. For a crime that happened in a town with no history of violence, in a home that should have been a fortress, the lasting horror is how completely the truth slipped away. The next case is far more recent, and in some ways far stranger. An elderly couple in a gated community in a crime that still makes no sense at all. Russell and Shirley Dermond. A retired couple in a quiet gated community missed a neighborhood party. When friends went to check on them, they walked into a scene that has baffled investigators ever since. Russell and Shirley Dermond were in their late 80s. A married couple who had lived for 15 years in an exclusive lakeside subdivision in Eatonton, Georgia. They were the kind of settled, well-liked retirees whose lives ran on familiar routines, the sort of neighbors everyone knew and no one had reason to fear for. That very routine is exactly what raised the alarm when it suddenly broke. Russell was last seen running errands at the start of May 2014. A few days later, after the couple failed to appear at a Kentucky Derby party they had been expected to attend, concerned neighbors went to their home to check on them. Inside the garage, they discovered Russell's body. In a detail that still defies explanation, his head was missing, and despite years of searching, it has never been recovered. Towels had been carefully arranged at the scene, suggesting whoever did this had taken their time rather than acting in panic. And where was Shirley? At first, she was simply gone, deepening the dread around an already disturbing discovery. Then, about 10 days later, fishermen found her body in the lake near their home, weighed down so she would not surface. She had died of blunt force injuries. Investigators believe Russell may have been shot before the rest, and one theory holds that the removal of his head was a deliberate attempt to prevent a ballistics match, a chilling sign of planning rather than chaos. So who would target a pair of elderly retirees? That is the question no one has been able to answer. Robbery was ruled out. Nothing of value appeared to be missing, and the couple's 4 adult children were cleared, with several of them passing polygraph examinations administered during the investigation. There was no obvious motive, no clear enemy, and almost no usable evidence left behind. One FBI agent on the case admitted it was one of the strangest cases he had ever seen. A remarkable statement from someone who had spent a career around violent crime. For years, the investigation seemed frozen, with no suspect and no answers. But there has been movement. Around 2023 and 2024, forensic specialists at 2 separate private labs working the case identified DNA at the scene that did not belong to either Russell or Shirley. It was the first time investigators had confirmed the presence of someone else's genetic material. A faint but potentially crucial thread connecting the crime to an unknown person who had been at the home. Could that DNA finally crack the case? Authorities are hopeful. The plan has been to test the sample further and run it through national databases, and eventually through genetic genealogy methods. The same approach that has solved other long cold cases by building family trees from crime scene material. To encourage tips, the FBI added a $20,000 reward that, combined with a local contribution, brought the total to $25,000. As recently as 2026, federal investigators were still actively promoting the case and pressing the public for help. What makes the Dermond case so frightening is its complete lack of logic. There was no robbery, no family dispute, no apparent reason for anyone to harm a quiet couple in their late 80s. Yet someone planned the crime with disturbing care, and then vanished, leaving behind a riddle that has resisted every answer for more than a decade. Somewhere out there, a head was never found, and a killer was never named. The setting only sharpens the fear. This was not a remote cabin or a dark alley. It was a gated lakeside community, the kind of place people move to precisely because it feels safe, with controlled access and watchful neighbors. And still, someone got in, did something almost unthinkable, and got out again without leaving a trail anyone could follow for years. The arranged towels, the weighted body in the lake, the missing head, all of it points to someone calm and deliberate. That is what keeps people awake over this case. Not chaos, but cold, careful intent that has never been explained. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case would also turn on DNA and a reward. A young woman who went for a late-night walk and never came home. Katie Janis. She took her dog for a late-night walk in a beloved city park, the way she had countless times before. She never walked back out. And nearly 5 years later, no one knows who was waiting there. Katie Janis was 40, a bartender and musician in Atlanta who was widely described as warm, creative, and devoted to the people around her. Someone friends saw as a fierce advocate for the causes she believed in. She lived near Piedmont Park with her longtime partner, Emma Clark, on the night of July 27th into July 28th, 2021. Katie left to walk Clark's dog, Bowie, a route so routine and familiar, it should have been the safest part of her day. There was nothing about that night to suggest anything was wrong. Surveillance footage captured her alive at about 12 minutes past midnight, crossing a brightly painted crosswalk at the edge of the park. It is one of the last confirmed images of her. When she did not return and stopped answering messages, Clark grew frightened and tracked Katie's phone, leading her to a horrifying discovery near one of the park entrances. Both Katie and the dog had been killed, and officers arrived a little after 1 in the morning to a scene that would shake the entire city. What investigators found was savage enough to suggest deep, personal rage. Katie had been stabbed dozens of times, and in a detail that has baffled everyone who has studied the case, letters had been carved into her body, a kind of message no one has ever been able to interpret. It was the first killing in that park in more than a decade, a place where families picnicked and joggers passed by every day. The brutality of it, in such a familiar setting, sent a wave of fear rippling through Atlanta. So how does a crime this violent in a public park go unsolved? Part of the answer is maddening. The cameras inside the park were inactive or outdated that night, meaning the very technology that might have captured the killer recorded nothing useful at the crucial moment. There were no clear eyewitnesses, and the location, while public and lively by day, was dark and quiet at that hour. The kind of place where a sudden act of violence could happen with no one nearby to see it. Whoever did this seems to have understood that, choosing a moment when the park's eyes were effectively closed. Did suspicion fall on anyone? For a time, Katie's partner endured intense public scrutiny and even threats, simply because she was the one who found the bodies. A cruel and common pattern in high-profile cases where grief is mistaken for guilt. But Emma Clark was never named a suspect by police. Investigators, working alongside the FBI's behavioral analysts and meeting regularly to compare notes, said they were leaning on science and technology, in particular DNA evidence, rather than on any named person. The problem was never a shortage of effort. It was a shortage of the one thing they needed most, a thread that led somewhere. Where does the case stand now? It remains open and active, with the focus squarely on forensic and genetic evidence. In the summer of 2025, authorities raised the reward to $25,000, up from a smaller sum, in hopes of shaking loose new information, with part of the money contributed by an animal welfare organization because the dog had been killed too. In early 2026, a major magazine feature revisited the case in depth, emphasizing the broken cameras, the absence of witnesses, and how few leads remain almost 5 years on. What makes the Janis case so frightening is how exposed it leaves all of us feeling. This was not a remote location or a high-risk situation. It was a routine dog walk in a city park people love, captured on camera moments before. And yet the killer struck with ferocious violence, left a message no one can decode, and slipped away into the dark without a trace. Atlanta later installed new cameras and added patrols, but none of that can undo what happened, and none of it has produced a name. Somewhere, that person may still be walking among an unsuspecting public, which is exactly the thought that keeps this case alive in people's minds. The next case also remains open. A young real estate agent who walked into an empty house for a showing that had been arranged just for her. Lindsay Buziak. A promising young real estate agent agreed to show an empty luxury home to new clients. It was a trap built entirely around her, and the people who set it have never been found. Lindsay Buziak was 24, an up-and-coming agent in the Victoria area of British Columbia, Canada. Her boyfriend belonged to a well-known local real estate family, and her own career was on the rise, full of the promise that comes with early success. In late January of 2008, she received a phone call that quietly unsettled her. From a woman with a foreign accent inquiring about a home in the $1 million range. What bothered Lindsay was not the request itself, but a detail underneath it. The caller had her personal cell number, something a random prospective buyer should not have had, and she mentioned her unease to people around her before the appointment. Still, this was her job, and a high-value client was a high-value client. She arranged to show an empty house in a quiet Saanich neighborhood on the evening of Saturday, February 2nd, 2008. Friends and family would later wish, painfully, that she had trusted that flicker of unease and stayed away. She walked into that house and never walked out. Lindsay was attacked and killed inside the empty home in what investigators believe was a swift assault from behind, as she showed no signs of having had a chance to defend herself. Nothing was stolen, and there was no other apparent motive. This had not been a robbery or a random encounter. Someone had lured her to that specific address at that specific time for the sole purpose of killing her. Was anyone close to her involved? Her boyfriend and a colleague were briefly looked at and quickly cleared, with time-stamped surveillance footage accounting for their whereabouts. And her boyfriend cooperated repeatedly over the years that followed, even passing a polygraph. The crime scene itself was strangely clean. It yielded no usable DNA or fingerprints, which suggested to investigators that this was the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Possibly people who had killed before and understood how to leave nothing behind. So who were the mysterious clients? Police identified 2 phones used by the supposed buyers, but the people behind them were never found. A theory connecting the killing to organized crime was investigated and ultimately set aside by detectives, who felt the personal, almost amateurish nature of the crime did not fit a professional hit. The result was a chilling and contradictory profile. A killing that was carefully planned, yet emotionally driven, carried out by phantoms who left almost nothing behind. The case drew so much attention that it was later featured on national television programs. Yet none of that exposure ever produced a suspect. Where does the case stand now? It remains unsolved, and it has become a long, painful saga for Lindsay's family. Her father has led an annual march in her memory every year on the anniversary. And in 2021, police said new advances in DNA had created fresh leads. Then, in November of 2025, Lindsay's mother posted a video online saying she had been told the active investigation had come to an end and that the detectives were being reassigned. The very next day, police pushed back. A Saanich police inspector publicly disputed that account, insisting the case remained active and ongoing, and explaining that periodically rotating investigators is standard practice that does not reflect any change in a case's status or priority. For a grieving family, even the question of whether anyone is still looking has become its own source of anguish. What terrifies people about the Buziak case is the premeditation. This was not a crime of opportunity. Someone studied her, obtained her private number, invented clients, chose an empty house, and executed a plan with cold precision, then dissolved into thin air. The idea that a person can be marked for death so deliberately, by strangers who are never identified and who leave no trace, is the kind of thought that lingers long after the lights go out. Nearly 2 decades later, her family still marches, still asks, and still waits for the names that have never come. The next case leaves the world of ordinary crime entirely, for a killing carried out by a cult that believed it could not be caught. Mark Kilroy. A college student on spring break crossed the border for one last night out with his friends. He was pulled into the orbit of a cult that believed murder could make its members invincible. Mark Kilroy was 21, a pre-med student at the University of Texas. The kind of bright, well-liked young man with his whole future ahead of him. In March of 1989, he and a group of friends were spending spring break in the border city of Brownsville, Texas, crossing into Matamoros, Mexico for the nightlife, just as thousands of American students did every year. On the night of March 14th, in the crowd and the noise of the bars, Mark became separated from his friends. He simply vanished from the street, and at first the others assumed he would turn up, the way friends usually do. What had taken him was not a random kidnapping. It was a drug trafficking cult, dubbed by the media with a sinister nickname, led by a charismatic and ruthless man named Adolfo Constanzo, who had twisted together fragments of folk religion into a violent belief system of his own. Alongside him was a woman named Sara Aldrete, whom followers called the Godmother. Constanzo had convinced his members of something monstrous, that performing ritual killings would make them supernaturally protected, even invisible to the police, and that this protection was what kept their trafficking operation safe. Mark was taken to a remote ranch and killed in one of these rituals. The horror of it is hard to put into words, and the details that emerged in the days that followed shocked even hardened investigators who thought they had seen everything. To the cult, he was not a person, but a component of a ceremony meant to keep them safe from the law, his life treated as a mere ingredient in a delusion. A massive cross-border search had erupted the moment he was reported missing, with his family, his friends, and authorities on both sides of the border desperate for any sign of him. It was a belief so deranged that it would, in the end, be the very thing that exposed them. How was a cult like this ever brought down? Through one of the strangest moments in true crime history. On the 1st of April, 1989, a cult member drove straight through a police checkpoint without stopping, reportedly because he genuinely believed the rituals had made him invisible to the officers and that they simply could not see his vehicle. Puzzled police followed him, and the trail led them to the ranch, where they uncovered a scene of mass death. Authorities ultimately recovered the remains of around 15 victims, Mark among them, ending a search that had gripped 2 countries. What happened to the people responsible? As police closed in weeks later, Constanzo realized the end had come. Cornered in a Mexico City apartment, he ordered one of his own followers to kill him and another member, choosing death over capture. The follower complied, and Constanzo died as bizarrely as he had lived. The surviving members were rounded up and prosecuted. Sara Aldrete, the so-called Godmother, was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term in Mexico, where she remains incarcerated with any possible release still years away. Other members received decades-long sentences for their roles in the killings, and the follower who carried out Constanzo's final order received a substantial term of his own. American authorities have said they stand ready to prosecute any surviving members for Mark's murder should they ever walk free, ensuring the case is not truly closed even now. What makes the Kilroy case so deeply disturbing is the gulf between the ordinary and the unthinkable. Mark was just a student enjoying spring break, doing what countless young people do every year along that border. He was swallowed by a world of cult belief and ritual violence so far outside normal experience that it barely seems real. His parents later channeled their grief into warning others and honoring his memory, helping to fund awareness efforts so that other families might be spared. Yet the case endures as a stark reminder that evil sometimes wears the mask of belief. and that a single wrong turn on a crowded street can lead somewhere no one could ever imagine. The next case was the work of one man alone, who killed for attention and then broadcast it to the world. Jun Lin. A promising international student moved across the world to build a new life in Canada. He crossed paths with a man who wanted infamy and who turned an unspeakable act into a performance. Jun Lin was 33, a Chinese international student studying at a university in Montreal. A young man who had traveled far from home in pursuit of his ambitions and was quietly building a life in a new country, far from everyone who loved him. The person who ended his life was Luca Magnotta, a former escort and minor model with a desperate, lifelong hunger for attention and a long trail of self-promotion behind him. Magnotta was already known to online communities for a deeply disturbing reason. Activists had spent considerable effort trying to identify him after he posted videos in which he harmed animals. A grassroots campaign that had been building for some time before anyone realized how far this man would eventually go. In late May of 2012, Magnotta killed and dismembered Lin in his Montreal apartment, filmed the act, and posted the video online under a lurid title designed to attract clicks. It was a calculated bid for notoriety, engineered to horrify and to spread as widely as possible across the darker corners of the internet. As if that were not enough, he then mailed parts of Lin's body to political party offices and to schools in another city, while other remains were discovered near his building. The sheer cruelty and theatricality of it set off alarm bells across the country and, very quickly, around the world, as people realized the video circulating online was not a hoax, but a record of a real killing. How do you catch someone who wants to be seen? In a sense, Magnotta made it both easier and harder. The video and the mailed packages triggered an international manhunt and an Interpol alert, as authorities raced to identify the man behind the footage before he could harm anyone else. Magnotta fled the country, hopping to Europe in an apparent attempt to outrun the very attention he had so deliberately courted. Tips poured in from people who had followed the online hunt for him, and the chase ended in Berlin, where he was recognized in an internet cafe and arrested in June of 2012. What did he claim at trial? Magnotta's defense argued that he was not criminally responsible due to mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. Prosecutors disputed that framing, pointing to the careful planning involved, the way he had courted attention, and his flight from the country, arguing his condition did not absolve him of responsibility. In December of 2014, after more than a week of deliberation, a jury rejected the insanity defense and convicted him of first-degree murder. Along with several other charges, he received an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, plus additional concurrent time. The story did not end at sentencing, though, and a later development reignited public anger. Correctional officials confirmed that Magnotta had been transferred in 2022 from a maximum security prison to a medium security facility, a move that only became widely known in 2024 and drew sharp political criticism. For the family of Jun Lin and for the public, the idea that someone who committed such a calculated and gruesome crime could be held in less restrictive conditions felt like a fresh wound, reopening a horror many had tried to put behind them. What makes the Magnotta case so haunting is the motive behind it. This was not a crime of passion or even of greed. It was a crime committed for fame, a young man's life taken and degraded so that his killer could feel important and watched by the world. Jun Lin had come to Canada chasing a future, working toward a degree and a life in a place he had chosen for himself. And he was murdered by someone who saw him not as a person, but as a prop in a grotesque pursuit of attention. The video Magnotta posted spread across the internet before it could be contained, meaning Lin's final moments were viewed by strangers who treated horror as entertainment. That cold, performative cruelty and the way it weaponized the very idea of going viral is what lingers long after the details fade. The final case is perhaps the most unsettling of all, because the victim, almost unbelievably, agreed to it. Burned Brandes. A man placed an advertisement online, searching for someone willing to die. Astonishingly, someone answered. And what followed remains one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded. The man behind the advertisement was Armin Mewes, a quiet computer technician living in a small German town. The kind of unremarkable neighbor no one looks at twice. Behind that ordinary exterior was a fixation so dark it is difficult to comprehend. Mewes had posted messages online seeking a willing victim, someone who would consent to being killed and consumed. It reads like something invented for a horror film, a premise too grotesque to be real. Yet it was entirely true, and the internet had quietly given him a place to find what he was looking for. The man who responded was Burned Brandes, an engineer in his 40s from Berlin. In early 2001, Brandes answered the advertisement under an alias, and the two men began to communicate. Astonishingly, Brandes appeared to be a willing participant in his own death, a detail that would later twist the legal system into knots and leave the public struggling to understand how such a thing could ever happen. The two arranged to meet, with both men, by all accounts, fully aware of how the encounter was intended to end. On March 9, 2001, the two met at Mewes' home, where Mewes killed Brandes and consumed parts of his body over the following months, storing remains in a freezer. The entire encounter was filmed, producing hours of footage that would later become central evidence. The specifics are far too grim to recount in detail, but the essence is this. A man was killed and cannibalized with what appeared to be his own consent by someone who had been planning and fantasizing about it for a very long time. How was something like this ever discovered? Mewes did not stop. He was arrested in December of 2002 after a student in another country alerted police to new online posts in which Mewes was apparently seeking further victims. It was a chilling realization for investigators. This was not a one-time aberration, but an ongoing appetite. When officers searched his home, they recovered the evidence and the videotape, and Mewes confessed. The case immediately became an international sensation, both for its grotesque nature and for the unprecedented legal questions it raised. And those legal questions were genuinely thorny. Because Brandes appeared to have consented, prosecutors faced a problem that German law had never truly anticipated, since the entire legal system is built around the assumption that no rational person freely agrees to be killed. In January of 2004, a court initially convicted Mewes of manslaughter rather than murder, sentencing him to 8.5 years. The relatively light sentence sparked public outrage across Germany and beyond, and prosecutors appealed, arguing the crime deserved the harshest possible classification regardless of any supposed consent from the victim. Did the appeal succeed? It did. A higher court ordered a retrial, and in 2006 a second court convicted Mewes of murder, sentencing him to life imprisonment, with the court also citing the disturbing of the peace of the dead. A later appeal to Germany's highest constitutional court was rejected, leaving the conviction firmly in place. In a strange and almost ironic epilogue, Mewes reportedly became a vegetarian behind bars and joined a prison environmental group, a jarring footnote to one of the most macabre cases in modern history. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.